All right, guys, we're going to move on now and look at individual muscles that are in our body that help to stabilize and to move the body. And we're going to start our examination of muscles at the core of the body. So when we talk about the core, there isn't actually like one straightforward definition, but for our purposes, I want you to think of the core as the trunk of the body, the torso, really the lower portion of the thoracic rib cage in the front section and through the front area of the body. And then we'll look at the back side of the body. So we have an anterior posterior aspect. So this sort of front section here that we typically think of as the core, but also some pelvic musculature involvement. And then as we turn our skeleton around, we're also considering what's happening in the back body. So really through the lumbar thoracic area, all of this is core. And the core is really, really significant and important for us because it's really where most all of our movement initiates from and where we have stability in this section from here all the way down to our legs and here up. And it's the area that gives us this connection between this upper girdle here and the lower girdles here. More specifically, we'll look at the major muscles that actually do this connecting of the upper and the lower body. And there's one in particular we'll want to look at. So we're going to jump in and let me share my screen. Okay. So you'll see on your handout, let's just look at the bones for a second. So I'm going to stop sharing. I forgot. So the bones of the core. So if we're talking about this generalized area here, we're talking about things that are going to connect to the spinal column on the front side as well as on the back side. And then we're also talking about a little involvement of the hips. So this iliac area here, remember, so this is, what is this called at the very top here? Good, iliac crest, and this is the ilium, and that's part of the hip bone, which has two other bones to it. Do you remember what those are? If not, go look them up. We'll review them though when we get down lower. And then also here in through the thorax, so a little bit lower here, we'll get some connection in down and through here. It's not like you have to specifically know the bones, but I just want you to know that area that we're looking at in general. And the, yeah, we said that, the thorax, the ribs. And then we want to talk about really the only major joints we're looking at here are remember our facet joints. So a little hard to see on our skeleton, but the joints here that connect each individual vertebra. So we can sort of turn here, and these little connections here, those are joints we want to be thinking about. And then also in this one, there will be some involvement of the sacroiliac joint as well. And then movements. So do you remember the movements of the spine? I hope so. If not, let's review them now. So easiest one to start, right? What's that forward motion when you come forward, right? Flexion, good. And then we come backwards. Extension, yeah. And then what if you go side to side? What do we call that? Good, lateral flexion. So lateral flexion in both directions, so to the right and the left. And then what happens when we have this, right? So what's that called? Spinal rotation. You got it. And then there's one more. Remember, it's not necessarily a movement per se, but there is movement associated with it. And it's really one of the important cues that we give when we are teaching. Axial extension. So remember that upward lifting motion, that lengthening through the spinal column, so that reaching through the crown of the head, and that sort of creating space in through the intervertebral disc here, right in between each of the individual vertebra. So we want to create that space. And there's a muscle that we're going to look at, a couple muscles actually, that we're going to look at that help us with axial extension. Okay, now let's go back to our screen. So the core is really about connecting the body. So the lower and the upper body creates a seamless and efficient movement. And it's designed to help us keep our trunk from excessively moving in all directions and allow us to move without compensation. So that's really important. So let's look at the primary muscles we'll start with spinal extension and postural muscles. So on the posterior side of the body, we're going to look at that. And there's going to be one that we look at on the anterior side of the body. So the most important group to know, now, before I start, let me say this. I'm going to give you a couple different muscles, but what I will do is highlight the main muscle or main muscle groups that are really mostly responsible for these particular movements. But again, remember in the video before this that we talked about, when we're talking about those synergistic muscles, a lot of times several muscles are contributing to the same movement. But there is usually one or two that have more of the primary responsibility for the movement. So when we talk about spinal extension, so that backward motion or postural muscles to hold us upright, the ones that we want to focus on are a group of muscles called the erector spinae. That includes three muscles, the iliocostellus, the longissimus, and the spinalis. Now, you don't have to remember these three individually. You can just know them as the erector spinae. And if you were to take your hand and put that hand along the back side of your body and sort of feel right onto the either side of the spine. So if you want to locate your spinous processes, those little bumps right in here. And then you want to feel on either side, you kind of feel these rope-like muscles. Those are your erector spinae. And we'll take a peek at them in our anatomy app. So here we go. Let me make this a little bit bigger for you guys. Maybe. There we go. So highlighted in orange are the erector spinae of the left side of the body. Now, there is erector spinae that run along the right side of the body. So I can pull that up for you guys so you can see that. So it's highlighted in orange. So where the tendons are, it's yellow in color. Let me go in and do you can see on the right hand side. So here we're highlighting the right hand side and the left hand side. And what you can notice is that there's this really beautiful sort of fan-like pattern that happens. So you can see they come all the way up into the cervical spine. So we'll just, and look how far up it goes. Look where this is. You know where that is? Right there. Oh, interesting. Up into the skull. So these guys are really important. They are the ones that create our extension, right? So this backward motion from the cervical spine through the thoracic and through the lumbar. We'll move it up a little bit. And we can go in and we can individuate these. I can highlight and sort of look at this individually for us. And then if we want to go back, I may be able to take and what we call explode. So separate them out. And you can see here, there are these three different sort of ribbons that happen. And you can see that they connect. They're not huge muscles, but together they are pretty significant. There we go. Okay, So they're the ones that help to maintain our posture and help us to do extension. So let's think of, before we move on and talk about the other two, what are some postures that we would think of that would help? What would be a postural pose? So something that has posture. It's pretty straightforward. So I would say mountain pose or Tadasana, right? So that standing upright in anatomical position gives this engagement of the erector spinae to hold us upright. And then if we're talking about extension, what would create a shortening of this muscle? Like what would create that when we have that? Anything that has to do with a backward bend, right? So we could say cobra or camel. We could even talk about upward facing dog. Anything that has that element of a back bend to it creates the shortening of the erector spinae. And if we were to think about this working in opposition, so what would actually lengthen the erector spinae? So what would find more stretch through that? So if extension or back bends create contraction in a shortening sense, what would create a lengthening? So something opposite of that, right? So it would have this rounding forward. So things like cat, row, or even rabbit. And you guys can play with this on your own as we're sort of going through this. Put your bodies into these positions and you can feel them. And know that when we meet live and in person, we'll be going through most all of these postures as they relate to the cambio sequence and connecting to the muscles that are really working. Good. So again, these are the erector spinae. Now the next muscles that we want to look at, so I'm going to go in and hide this side, and now I'm going to whoops. We're going to go in and look at the next muscle that also contributes to extension as well as postural muscles. So let me highlight, oops. So I'm going to highlight this guy and then I'm going to hide him for us. And you'll see the next layer of muscle. So this muscle under here that lays deep to the erector spinae, so it lies, so here's the erector spinae, and then underneath it, so if we move the erector spinae like we just did, here's the multifidi. I call them multifidi because there's two of them, just like we had. There's two sets of the erector spinae, one on the left side of the spine and one on the right side of the spine. Same thing with the multifidus. There's a multifidus on the right side of the spine and a multifidus on the left side of the spine. So you can see this is a really long muscle, right? And it runs all the way along the length of the spine, just below. So here's the axis and the atlas, and there's this little tiny connection here. And then it runs down through the cervical spine, how many vertebrae are in the cervical spine? Does anybody remember? 7, good. And then we worked our way down to the thoracic spine. So the thoracic spine coordinates and connects with the rib cage. So how many thoracic vertebrae are there? You got it, 12. And then it runs down through where? What's this? What's this part of the spine called? Yep, lumbar spine. And then what else does it run down into? Here we go. Here's our sacrum. Sacrum. And then here's that sacroiliac joint that we've been talking about. So let's go in and I want to take a peek and be able to just show you this. I forgot to do it in the erector spinae, so we can come back. But we can actually look at, which I love about this, is the extension piece of it. Oh my goodness, excuse me, y'all. I tried to stop the video, but I couldn't. So let's watch extension and hyperextension. It's just going to take a minute to maybe pull this up for us. Good. So here is, I'm going to turn it. Oh, I don't think I can. Maybe I can rotate this for us. It just takes a while. So here is this extension, right? So that's what we're looking at, this extension. So here's the erector spinae, the multifidi is underneath, and now it's going to go forward. And you can see, isn't that cool? So here we are, and we're back in extension. And it's actually highlighting for you in orange on this side, the multifidi, and its role in that. But you notice how it brings in all of the other muscles that are responsible for this action as well. Whoops. Cool, huh? So you can see here on this side, there's a lot of other muscles involved in extension, and then in hyperextension. So technically, when we're talking about extension, we have this lengthening here, and then we kind of come back, and it's sort of referred to as hyperextension, but it's okay. You can just refer to them as both as extension. So we'll pause that and go back. Now, there's one more muscle that we want to look at. And like I said, you can see there's a lot of other muscles. So they're talking about some other muscles besides the multifidi and the erector spinae. And a lot of those are the erector spinae muscles divided up. But they're working in conjunction together. Now, there's one more muscle I want us to look at that helps with postural movement or posture for us. And it works in conjunction with these guys. So we're going to flip this around and come to the front side of the body. And I'm going to move this up and then tilt him back a little bit. So this big muscle, you guys are going to become real familiar with this. We've already talked about it in one of our previous lectures, but this muscle here, you can see, let me see if I can highlight it. It's kind of hard because it will only let me highlight one portion of it. So this is called the psoas muscle, and then this is the ilius. So these two together make up this iliopsoas muscle. And oftentimes we would just refer to it as the psoas muscle. But there's actually two parts to it. And the psoas muscle, you can see, where does it run, right? So it has this really interesting insertion up here. I'm going to click this and give this, because they're, let's see, yeah, it's got all of these different origins on and along the vertebral column, the lumbar spine here. So this is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then there's also on T12. And so this thick muscle runs down along the length of most of the lumbar spine, along the lateral aspects of the outside portion of it. And it connects in with what we call the ilias. So the iliopsoas muscle. So if I highlight this, it'll pull this up over here. The iliacus, we call it the iliacus. And then this two together make the iliopsoas, and they come down and it inserts here. So remember we talked about this section right here. Do you remember what this is called on the on the femur? So I'll pull it up for you guys so you can see. So this is called the lesser trochanter. So remember we had the greater trochanter and the lesser trochanter on the femur. So here's the greater trochanter, and this is the lesser trochanter. So this muscle really helps to keep us in good postural alignment. And what it does is it actually helps us maintain just that slight little lumbar lordosis that we have here. So you can see this, remember this lordotic curve. So we have that curve in the spine and the lumbar section here. And this helps to sort of pull the front pieces of the vertebra or the vertebrae forward so that it keeps that. Now, you can imagine if this muscle gets really tight and compresses down, that it could actually create some really extensive lumbar lordosis for people, which could in turn cause low back pain. So this muscle is one we talk about a lot in yoga. And I'm going to actually visit it. We're going to visit more with this muscle in an exercise that we're going to do later on after we're done reviewing all these. And we're also going to talk about it when we talk about respiration, because it's intimately connected to our respiratory system from a neurological and blood vessel supply, as well as musculature. So the diaphragm, which we'll learn about when we talk about the respiratory system, sits here. So there's this connection in with our psoas and our diaphragm. Now this is also the muscle itself. Oh, here we go. I can highlight the iliopsoas for you. There we go. Let's turn that back around. So everything will get highlighted now. There we go. So here's the two muscles together. So the iliopsoas, this inner portion, the more medial portion is called the psoas, and this is called the iliacus muscle. The psoas originates on the vertebral bodies of the spine, and the iliacus originates on the fossa here of the ilium. And then they come down, join, and connect at the lesser trochanter. And now we're just talking about this here in terms of postural muscle. And then when we get down into some other movements that we're going to look at, the psoas will come into play again. Because as you can imagine, just look at where it runs, right? So it runs here down to the femur. It is the only muscle that actually connects the upper body to the lower body. So down here, all the way here, it's the one muscle that runs all the way from the upper body down to the lower body. So just start to think, right? So what happens when this muscle shortens? What's the movement going to be when the muscle shortens? So you guys can think about that, and then we'll visit that when we get there. All right, so in review, we looked at the postural muscles of the core as well as the spinal extensors. So this is the postural muscle we're looking at, which is what's its name again, even though you see it already here, right? The iliopsoas, good. And then when we turn around, what is this muscle here? That's the deeper muscle that we looked at, this guy. Yep, this is the multifidi, or the multifidus. The singular is multifidus. And then what lays on top of the multifidus? What is that group of muscles called? You got it, the erector spinae. And we will pull those up just so you can see them one more time. There you go. Good. So in the next video, we are going to talk about the muscles responsible for spinal flexion. So I'll catch you in the next one.